and that that involves discussions around the notion of grounding, fundamentality, explanation, and a part of that research is what I am bringing here today with my paper. There is still work for the fundamental. So let me just begin by sharing my screen. Uh, just a quick check, is my screen visible? Yeah, okay, thank you. So that's what I'm presenting today on. Let me begin with with a scenario. Imagine that you are teaching a class in metaphysics and you are talking about sets that day, and particularly you're talking about a singleton set that contains you as the member. So, for example, me. So we are, let's say you're talking about Tarun singleton set, and an inspired student taking classes, in the other topics of metaphysics. They're really interested about getting a complete understanding of things. So they suddenly ask you, what, like, why that set exists? Why Tarun Singleton set exists? And you answer back, well, Tarun Singleton set exists because Tarun exists. We usually take that sets exist because their members exist. And after hearing this answer, it seems that the student is still not satisfied. They said, no, I'm looking for a complete explanation of this. Like, then why does Tarun exist? And then you answer back, Tarun exists because of a bunch of factors, maybe because Tarun's parents exist, or some facts about the genetic transference, or some facts about the working of the vital organs, and so on. But then the student still, you know, not fully satisfied, again ask, but why do those facts exist? And then you repeat the same sort of reasoning, applying the same reasoning. You say, because Tarun's parents exist, because Tarun's grandparents exist, and some facts about genetic transference, or some facts about the vital organs, or what makes anything exist, and so on. Now, the question that I am interested in is, when one is looking for, as in the case of a student, a complete understanding or complete explanation of a phenomena of fact, these chains of explanation that we have created, do they need to end somewhere for them to be complete or not? So that's the question I'm interested in, and that's the question I'm bringing in today through this paper. In the contemporary metaphysics, this question is understood as the debate between the following thesis, which is metaphysical foundationalism and metaphysical infinitism. So, in my paper, I am trying to defend foundationalism against infinitism. And how I'm trying to do that is, I'm trying to defend the most robust argument, the strongest argument that has been given for foundationalism, that's developed by Ricky Bliss in What Worked the Fundamental. So I'm trying to defend this argument from a recent attack on the infinitist side. That's from Oberle in his paper No Work for Fundamental Facts. So that's what I'm trying to do in this paper. I'm trying to defend foundationalism against infinitism, and how I'm trying to do that is by defending the externality argument. That's the strongest argument given for foundationalism, and from a recent challenge on the infinitist side. So let me unpack what these theses mean and what these arguments are all about. Before that, just a primer on how to understand these theses. Now, Our world contains many constituents. It's a very varied world. It's not a flat world. It contains individual sets, tables, table parts, particles, molecules, wars, victories, and whatnot. But interestingly, some of these entities depend on other entities for their existence. For example, we make the following claims that the Socrates singleton depends on the individual Socrates for its existence, the claim in the imagined scenario, or a table exists in virtue of table parts being arranged in a certain manner, or a chess player victory is constituted in her opponent's king being checkmate. In these and the following examples, we think that one constituent of reality is metaphysically determining another constituent of reality. So, in these examples, the entities on the right hand side of the bold phrases, for example, Socrates, metaphysically determines the singleton Socrates, or table parts being arranged in a certain manner are determining the table's existence or the nature that the table has. And in contemporary metaphysics, the relation that enjoys the most traction to capture this form of metaphysical determination is grounding. It's the it's the relation that's getting the most traction in the metaphysical market, because philosophers believe that it is the form of dependence that captures this metaphysical strictness or connection that we think many entities have with each other. In turn, the entities that ground the other entities, the entities on which those are dependent, those are called the grounds, and the entities that are being dependent or those are getting grounded are called the grounded entities. So grounds ground the grounded entities. Interestingly, grounding is also seen as a level connector, that it connects various levels of reality. How this happens is in connecting these entities, it forms a hierarchy between them, a structure between them, wherein we take that the things that are getting grounded, the things that are dependent, those are less fundamental than the things that ground them. So it links more fundamental things with less fundamental things, or more basic goings on with less basic going ons. In linking that, this creates this chain of dependence where the members of the chain, they are connected through this relation of grounding, generating a hierarchy or structure among these entities. So that's what the debate is about. That's what we are interested in, is what is this overarching structure of reality? In other words, whether these chains of dependence, whether they end somewhere or not, or they should end somewhere or not, given the other considerations that we have towards reality. So that's what the debate is about. Now, before proceeding, there are these couple of notions we need to be clear about. Grounding is usually taken to be one-to-many relation. So there is an entity, be it fact, property, whatever that entity is, that's being grounded by many entities. So it's one-to-many relation. Another distinction that we need to keep in mind is the distinction between full and partial grounding. To bring this to an example, what grounds the fact, this existential fact, that there are 20 people present in this meeting? Now, each person's individual presence partially grounds this fact, and collectively taken together, they fully ground. Or to bring this point through another example, if we have A disjunction B, A or B, then A would fully ground the disjunction. But if we have a case of conjunction A and B, then A partially grounds the conjunction, and B partially grounds the conjunction, and they together fully grounds the conjunction. So that's the distinction between full and partial ground here that we're working with. Now, there is a lot of controversy and a disagreement among metaphysicians about the nature of grounding and what that entails. But there is a consensus uh, that's there among them that at least it is very tightly linked with the notion of explanation. Now, the notion of explanation that they have in mind is non causal, and it's usually termed as metaphysical explanation or constitutive explanation. So, grounds in grounding the grounded, they also metaphysically explain the grounded. For example, if I say that, take the fact that this coffee is hot, and you give its grounds that it's because the mean kinetic energy of the part molecules is very high. So that's the ground of the fact that the coffee is hot. So in giving this, in giving the grounds of that fact, we are also metaphysically explaining the fact that what makes the coffee hot is its molecules having a high mean kinetic energy. So basically, there are two camps here on the question of the relation between grounding and explanation. The first camp says that the relation is of identity, that grounding is nothing but metaphysical explanation, that it is identical to metaphysical explanation. And the second camp says that grounding backs metaphysical explanation, probably parallel to how causation backs causal explanations. So either way, we need not get into this debate. Either way, what the point for us that we need to bring home is that grounds explain the grounding, right? Grounding, whenever we are talking about grounding, we're also in similar manner talking about metaphysical explanation. So if we take this relation between grounding and explanation, our debate comes about to be whether these chains of explanation, we are talking about chains of dependence now, we can also talk about chains of explanation, whether they end somewhere or not. Or, in other words, do we need a chain stopper or an explanation stopper? So that's what the debate is about. Now, we have three contenders in this debate. Broadly speaking, although there can be a hybrid view as well. First is foundationalism. We can take a clue from the very phrase foundationalism. This view posits a foundation and states that what occupies this foundation are fundamental entities or fundamentalia. Now, they ground everything else. So all the entities that there are, they are ultimately grounded by these fundamental entities. But a special fact about these fundamental entities are that they are themselves ungrounded. So they are ungrounded entities that ground something, everything else in this foundation. So that's the view of metaphysical foundationalism, whereas infinitism states that there are infinitely, or they can be infinitely descending chains, so without reaching any fundamental level. So they allow infinite descent, whereas foundationalism does not. And coherentism is another view that states that there could be circular structure or loops in our chains, in our structure. So these are the three views, although it, the web of chains would be much more complex. But just to give a pictorial intuition pump, I have taken the most basic structure. So that's what foundationalism would look like. So we have these entities E1, which is grounded by E2 or explained by E2, its existence. So E2 is grounded by E3, which is grounded by E4, and ultimately, it's the whole chain is grounded by this fundamental entities that lie in this foundation. So that's foundationalism. Here in infinitism, we have that similar chain, but it's infinitely descending. There's this infinite descent without reaching any fundamental level. And coherentism, we get loops like that in the structure. Here in my paper, I'm interested in this debate between foundationalism and infinitism. Now, coming to the argument at play here. Now, although there have been few arguments that have been put forward for foundationalism, and it's interesting to note here that foundationalism has been the orthodox view among metaphysicians, and surprisingly, they were not explicit arguments developed or given for this view. It was just assumed. And recently, we have seen a revival in this uh, in these views, and that have put pressure on people endorsing foundationalism, given that we have alternative views being developed to give or develop an explicit argument. So we have had few arguments that have been come, but people think the most robust, the strongest argument that has been given for foundationalism is the externality argument. Now, this argument works in two steps. It's in the first step, it states that there is a job that needs to be done. And in the second step, it says that job can only be done by foundationalism. Any anti-foundationalist view cannot perform that job. Therefore, we should prefer foundationalism. So that's why the title is for the work for the fundamental. It ensures that there is work for the fundamental that can only be done by these fundamental entities. So we find this argument in Bliss, although Bliss develops it, does not endorse it. And in the first premise, the job that's being stated that needs to be done is that we are looking for an explanation. There is an explanatory job. So there is an explanation for why there are any dependent entities whatsoever. So that's what we need an explanation of, why there are any dependent entities at all in this world, rather than not existing. So that's the first premise. In the second premise, it says that no dependent entity can explain why there are any dependent entities whatsoever. So no dependent entity is up for this job, for fulfilling this explanatory job successfully. So we need to go external to the chain. So that's why this is called externality assumption. And what lies external to the chain is the fundamental entity. So therefore, there must be something fundamental. So that's how the argument works. It says that there is a job that needs to be done, an explanatory job, and we cannot perform that job on infinitism, and therefore we should prefer foundationalism. So that's how the argument works. Now, Oberle from the infinitist side tries to attack this argument, and in in his attack, he mentions that we need to get clear about what the explanatory target in our premise one is, that we need a clarity that what actually we are seeking explanation for. So what is our explanatory target in premise one? Is it an existential fact, the fact that there are any dependent entities? Well, that cannot be the case, because usually it's a grounding principle that we take, that existential facts are grounded in their instances. So there is nothing left to be explained if we take the explanatory target to be an existential fact, because we have explanation of the dependent facts in the chain. So that won't work. Is our explanatory target a fact involving set, conjunction, or mereological fusion? That also does not work, because sets are grounded in their members, conjunctions in their conjuncts, and fusion in their parts. So then also there is nothing left to be explained. So Burley's suggestion is that we should take the explanatory target, we should understand it as a plurality. That what we are seeking an explanation of is the plurality of dependent entities. We are not seeking an explanation of this entity or that entity. We are seeking an explanation of the plurality of dependent entities. Now, a quick comments on this proposal. So, first, it commits us to a plural notion of ground, and that's not an orthodox view. It's usually taken to be one to many relation, not many to many. So, that's we are moving towards uh, the general consensus here, although there have been few accounts that have been developed. And secondly, there are ways perhaps available to the foundationalists to not prefer this construal, this plurality construal of the explanatory target that I discuss in the paper. But we want to, yes, Varun.
Hey, sorry to pause you. Can you
Yeah, no
please?
worries.
I mean, I just lost the track of Oblery's construal. I mean, can you just repeat it again? Sorry, I mean, like I was trying to think through it, but like I lost the
No
chain.
worries.
Yeah,
No
yeah,
worries.
sorry.
No worries. Yeah. So what we are talking about here is that what should our explanatory target in premise one should be. Here, the premise one is there is an explanation for why there are dependent entities whatsoever. So, what is the explanatory target here? What we are trying to explain? First suggestion is that we are trying to explain an existential fact, the fact that there are dependent entities. Now, in grounding literature, we take that an existential fact is grounded in its instances. Now, if we have an existential fact that there are dependent entities or dependent facts, then this would be explained by each one of the dependent entities or facts that there are. So let's consider the infinitist chain here. Yeah. So let's consider the infinite chain here. Now it says that if all these entities are there, and we are talking about the existential fact that there are dependent facts, then that fact would be partially explained by E1, E2, E3, E4. Now, we'll get a complete explanation of this existential fact as it is explained in terms of its instances. So we do not have to go beyond the chain, but foundationalism says that we need to go, right? So that's why this proposal wouldn't work. Now, the second proposal is that we can understand the explanatory target as a set. So probably we are talking about the set of dependent entities, but we know that sets are grounded in their members. They are explained by their members' existence. So that set would be explained by E1, E2, E3, E4, and then also we will get a complete explanation. Similarly, the suggestion about fusion that would be explained in terms of parts, or conjunction that would be explained in terms of conjuncts. So that's why Oberle thinks that the most plausible construal or the most plausible way to understand the explanatory target here would be through the notion of plurality. That I'm not seeking an explanation of an existential fact of dependent entities. I'm not seeking an explanation of set of dependent entities. What I'm seeking an explanation of is the plurality of dependent entities. Now, the good thing about this is it does not commit us to a notion of a set or a conjunction or a fusion. So that's the good thing going about this proposal. And but as I mentioned, that it commits us to the plural notion of ground, and that's not an orthodox view. But if we can supply good reasons for that, then it's perfectly fine to move away from orthodoxy. But perhaps there are other ways available to the foundationalist to understand this explanatory target. But I want to grant Oberle the infinitist as much as we can. So we want to argue against the strongest version of our opponent. So let's go with the plurality construal. So does that make
Yes, yes.
and
Thanks, Tarun.
yes, okay,
Just one
okay.
small clarification. Plurality here
Hmm.
is about the plural instances of the same kind of entity, or plural kinds of entities existing, or plural dependencies existing. So plurality is acting at what level here?
So plurality here would be just a collection. If I just like dependent entity one, like E1, E2, E3, that's just if I just take this collection without calling it a set or a conjunction or anything, just like a collection laid bare, that's a plurality for us. Yeah. Okay. So let's grant Oberle that we have the most plausible way to understand this target, explanatory target in this argument is through plurality. So we get the new version of the externality argument. In this argument, what we are seeking explanation of is the existence of the plurality of dependent entities. Now, our externality assumption becomes that no dependent entity can explain the existence of the plurality of dependent entities. Therefore, there must be something fundamental. Now, what is the justification of this externality assumption here? That why cannot a dependent entity explain the existence of the plurality of dependent entities? Why we need to move outside the chain? Now, usually the pertinent justification for EA star here is that explanation that disobey this assumption, they are incomplete in some sense. That probably we get if we have this infinitist chain, we get an explanation of E1 in terms of E2. Okay, we get an explanation of E2 in terms of E3. We are getting some explanation, but we are not getting complete explanations of these entities. So the notion of complete explanation here is to be understood as an explanation of an entity's existence, understanding or demanding an explanation of each and every aspect of its existence is to demand an explanation of all the facts related to its existence. So if the student's query or the demand is for a complete explanation, then we need to be able to explain each and every aspect or each and every fact related to its existence. And that brings me to endorse this principle, which I term as existence essence principle. Through this, what this principle states that the complete explanation of event's existence involves an explanation of the entirety of event's nature. So if we understand complete the notion of complete explanation in this way, then we get this principle that ties the notion of existence and essence, that the complete explanation of event's existence involves an explanation of the entirety of event's nature. If we want to explain event's existence, completely explain it, then we would need to explain its nature, how that entity is. So that's the notion of complete explanation here. So the infinitist argument turns out to be through endorsing these following principles. First principle that Oberle endorses is called the Hume-Edwards principle, the grounding version of the Hume-Edwards principle. This states that the plurality of all dependent entities are fully grounded if and only if each member of the plurality is fully grounded. So the plurality is fully grounded if and only if each member of the plurality is fully grounded. Now, this only works when we allow distributivity, which states that the individual members of each plurality are grounded in individual members of others. Now, I identify further two assumptions in Oberle's argument. First assumption is the full grounds assumption. It says that every dependent entity in the infinitist chain has full grounds. The second assumption that I identify is the full grounding complete explanation assumption, which states that if delta fully grounds E, then delta completely explains E's existence. So if we have a full grounds of an entity, we get a complete explanation of that entity's existence. Now, just putting these all together, we get this argument of from the infinity side. So that's the infinity's challenge. We get this argument where in premise one, it stated that if each dependent entity of the plurality of all dependent entities has a complete explanation of its existence, then the plurality has a complete explanation through these following principles. And the second premise says on infinitism, each dependent entity of the plurality has a complete explanation. Therefore, the plurality has a complete explanation. Therefore, there is no work for the fundamental entity. So the argument in a nutshell says if what the foundationalist is demanding is complete explanation of the existence of the entities in the chain, then the infinitist says that we have that. How we have that is if each entity has a complete explanation, then the plurality, the whole chain has a complete explanation because of GHEP distributivity. And it says that certainly on infinitism, each dependent entity has a complete explanation. So that's the infinitist argument. So once we have the complete explanation, we don't need fundamental entities. This explanatory job can be done within infinitism. So that's the infinitist argument. Now, I'll say that the major metaphysical weightlifting in this argument is done by rather premise two. This assumption that each dependent entity, that each member of the chain has a complete explanation of its existence. So my claim is that the foundationalists should go after this premise too. The premise that's doing the major weightlifting in for the infinitist. So I try to deny the premise two of the infinitist argument. And how I try to do that is if we can find a way to link the success of E1's explanation with the success of E2's explanation, and if we can find a way to link the success of E2's explanation with E3's explanation, we will have the success of E1's explanation hostage to the success of the subsequent member's explanation. And since on infinitism, this this explanation, this chain never ends, so we won't have a complete explanation. Yes, Megha.
Can you please go back to the second point that you said that you're contending against it? I just missed.
Sure, no worries. So that's the premise two that I want to argue against, which says that on infinitism, each entity has a complete explanation of its existence. So that's the premise I'm arguing against. Yeah. So how I'm going to do that is if I can find a way to link one entity's explanation with the second entity's explanation, and that entity's explanation with the subsequent entity's explanation. If I can make the success of the first entity's explanation hostage to the success of second entity's explanation, and that itself is hostage to the success of the third entity's explanation, and if this explanation never ends, then we won't have the explanation being completed. So the explanation will always be postponed and never completed. Just paying salute to the to Schaeffer's place that on infinitism, that being is always deferred, never achieved. So here, in terms of explanation, the explanation is always postponed, never achieved. This won't be the case in foundationalism. Why? even if we find a way to link the success of entities existence with the success of the explanation of the subsequent entity's existence, this explanation would be completed because this chain ends somewhere. So the idea is, if we can find a way to link the success of the explanation of the members of the chain, and if we are able to find that link, then if the explanation does not end, we'll be getting an infinitely postponed explanation which is never completed. Let's see if we can do that or not. So the foundationalist needs to find at least one infinite dependent chain on which it's not the case that each member has a complete explanation of its existence, because that's what we are arguing for, arguing against, right? On infinitism, each dependent entity has a complete explanation of its existence. So we want to deny that. So if the foundationalist can find at least one infinite chain on which it's not the case that each member has a complete explanation of its existence, that's enough to diffuse the infinitist argument. So let's see if we can indeed find such a regress. Now consider the relationship of set membership, the relation that I talked about in the introduction. Now it's a common view that sets are grounded in their members. Now we use this relation to generate an infinite grounding regress. So if we have a set that has another set as its sole member, and that set has another set as its sole members, so we generate an infinite sequence of the singletons, which have singletons as their members. Okay, so we get a grounding chain of the form that S1 is grounded in S2, S2 is grounded in S3, S3 is grounded in S4, and so on ad infinitum, where all these entities are singleton sets. So that's the chain I'm working with. So here we have E1, which is a set, E2, which is part of E1, E3 is part of E2, E4 is part of E3, right? So E1 is grounded in E2, E2 is grounded in E3, E3 is grounded in E4, and where all of them are singleton sets. So that's the set membership regress that I want to work with. And in the context of our argument, now we need to determine this infinitist assumption that whether each set has a complete explanation of its existence on this regress or not. And I claim that it's not the case that each set has a complete explanation. And how I try to do that is by finding a way to link the success of explanation of one entity's existence with the success of explanation of the subsequent entity's existence. And how I try to do that is by endorsing these two principles that I've adapted from Cameron. He endorses a version of these in terms of ontological dependence, but I've adapted here in terms of grounding. The first principle is the grounding grounded, which is actually an answer to the question that what grounds the grounding facts. So here, if we have a grounding fact that if E1 is grounded in E2, then the claim is that it is partially grounded by the fact that E2 exists. So that's what this principle states. Now, the justification for this principle is that grounding is an internal relation. So grounding is usually taken like ontological dependence and internal relation, which what's an internal relation? Which holds in virtue of the nature of its relator. So that's a internal relation. And the idea is that grounding holds any relation between two entities holds in virtue of the nature of those entities. So we have three options here. Either this relation, this grounding fact holds either because of the nature of E1 alone, or because of the nature of E2 alone, or because of the nature of both E1 and E2. Now, second and third option has something going for them. If we take the claim that this fact E1 is grounded in E2, it's grounded or completely explained by E2 only, then that matches with the view where we take that the dependent entities are nothing over and above than the entities that ground them. So if God has to create E1 and create the fact that E1 is grounded in E2, God just needs to create E2 alone with the nature that E2 has. So that's for E2. What if we try the case that it's this grounding fact E1 is grounded in E2? It holds because of both E1, and it's both dependent on both E1's and E2's nature. Now that is completely equal for somebody who is completely valid for somebody who is endorsing the view that claims that dependent entities are as substantial part of the furniture of the world as the entities that they depend on. So that this view has something going on for it as well. But the only implausible the option here is even, because no one thinks that the base entities, the entities that ground, they are nothing over and above the dependent entity. So the only implausible option here is the first even option, and e either of these two options work for me, because my claim is it is partially grounded by the fact that E2 exists. So in case of second, this satisfies the principle. In case of the third option, where both E1 and E2 are grounding, so E2 is partially grounding this fact. So that's the first principle that I'm endorsing, which states that if E1 is grounded in E2, then it is partially grounded by the fact that E2 exists. The second principle that I endorse, I term as essence. If E1 is grounded in E2, it is part of the nature of E1 that E1 is grounded in E2. In other words, it is part of the nature of the grounded entities that they are grounded in the entities they are grounded in. So justification for this is that's it's very plausible that if we just take the Finian notion of a sense, where we characterize grounding in terms of known model notion of a sense, which is if E1 is grounded in E2, if and only if E2 is a constituent of an essential property of E1, if we just understand a sense as definition of that entity or what it is to be that entity, then the essence of the grounded entity, which in case is set, involves the entity that grounds it, which is the members, and that's what essence is saying. Now, my claim is these two principles, I'm not claiming that these two principles are true for every grounding regress. My much humbler claim is that these two principles are at least true for the grounding relation between sets. For the set membership grounding relation, these two principles hold. Now, through these, we can find a way to connect the explanation of the entities of the Infinitists chain in the following manner. We want to get a complete explanation of our first entity's existence. We want a complete explanation of its existence. So we would need to explain all the facts about S1 such that nothing is left to be explained about S1's existence, right? The first set's existence. Now, given the existence essence principle right here, or the complete explanation that I endorsed here, which says that the complete explanation, if we want to get a complete explanation of E1's existence, then we would need to get an explanation of the entireties of E1's nature. Now, this translates our demand of explaining S1 with the demand to explain S1's nature as well. So that's what EE is entailing. Now, so what explains S1's existence and the nature it has? It's the fact that S2 exists, right? And the fact that S1 is grounded in S2. That's very simple. That what explains S1's existence and the nature, it's because S2 exists. and the fact that S1 is grounded in S2. Now, given essence, the fact that S1 is grounded in S2 is part of the nature of S1, and which is exactly what we need to explain in the first place. Since we are looking for the explanation of S1's nature that was granted by EE, that we would need to explain S1's nature. Now, if the explanation of S1's existence and nature has in its explanation the need to explain S1's nature only, then the problem runs. So thus the fact that S1 is grounded in S2 is part of what we want to explain and what is being used to explain. So we would need to explain it as well. So it's very simple. What explains S1's existence and the nature it has? It is S2 and S1 being grounded in S2. But given a sense, the fact this S1 is grounded in S2 is part of the nature of S1. So what we are explaining with is exactly what we want to explain. So there is this circular worry here. So we would need to explain it. So, but given this grounded principle, which says that if E1 is grounded in E2, it is partially grounded by the fact that E2 exists. This fact's explanation involves explaining E2's essence. And in this manner, what we have done is, for the success of complete explanation of S1's existence, we need to successfully explain the existence of S2. So using those principles, we have found a way to link the success of S1's existence with the success of S2's existence and apply the same reasoning for the success of complete explanation of S2's existence. We need to successfully explain the existence of S3 and so on ad infinitum. As a result, our original explanation, our original demand that why S1 exists or has the nature it has is hostage to explaining the existence and nature of S2 and so on, and the explanation is never achieved. The success of the explanation is always postponed and never achieved, never established. So we never successfully managed to explain the existence and nature of S1, and this would only be successfully explained if there is a last link in the chain, because then this otherwise the explanation would be indefinitely postponed and it would never be complete. Only when there is a last link to the chain, which is the fundamental entities, which is the fundamental level, we get a complete explanation of the existence of that entities. So hence, contra infinitis, we don't get a complete explanation of the existence of each member of the plurality in our set membership regress. So as a result, premise 2 in the infinitist argument is false. So in a nutshell, if the foundationalist is asking, foundationalist, she's asking an explanation for a complete explanation of an entity's existence. It says that we do not get a complete explanation of the plurality. Why? Because we are not getting a complete explanation of each member of the plurality. And here comes Oberle and the infinitist, who says that we get the explanation of each member of the plurality. By how we get that? We get a explanation of each member of the plurality, and that's what the foundationalist is denying. That's what I'm denying, that we do not get. The problem is not that each member has an explanation and therefore it is not getting transferred or translated to the whole chain. The problem is that each member lacks the complete explanation, therefore the chain itself lacks a complete explanation. That's why we need to move external to the chain. That's why there has to be a last link to the chain for the explanation to be completed. So that's how the foundationalist secures a position for fundamental entities here. So that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to develop a strategy for the foundationalist to defend the externality argument against the infinitist challenge. And in this process, we have got a novel defense of the plurality version of the externality assumption based on the principles that haven't received significant attention in the literature. And I hope that in the paper I've done enough to justify those principles. And but I need to note here that this is a partial defense of the externality argument. The externality argument, so we are dealing in this talk and in my paper with the second premise. But we need to remember the first premise, which says that there is an explanation that we need. Now, this, where do we get, how do we justify this explanatory demand? Where are we getting this explanatory need for? And the metaphysicians agree that that premise, that demand, is a version of some principle of sufficient reason. So some restricted or unrestricted version of principle of sufficient reason is at play that justifies the first premise, that explanatory demand. So the complete defense would involve justifying that explanatory demand in the first place, and which in turn would involve motivating some version of the principle of sufficient reason. And in the past, we have seen that that has not been a small order, but in recent works, we have seen a revival of the rationalistic metaphysics and some recent defense by MEG and Raven for the principle of sufficient reason. So there is still work for the fundamental, although it's not a small task, it's not small order, but there is still work for the fundamental, and the foundationalists should get to it. So that's it for my talk, that there is still work for the fundamental. Thank you, everyone. I'm open to any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tarun. Yeah, people can raise their hands and we can follow that order. I saw Varun's hand first. So Varun.
Tarun, fascinating
Yes,
paper,
yes, sir.
and was very excited to hear the whole argument. To begin with,
Thank you.
I have just a clarificatory question. So I make sure I have got the whole argument correct.
Mhm.
The one of the first clarification that I want is I'm very surprised that I don't know his name, Auberly or whatever it is, the author
Mhm.
who's supporting the infinitism
Mhm.
chain, that he makes an argument that, like, say, if I've got the argument correct, it is that um, to the only infinitism is the only position that can give the full explanation of the first entity because of the infinite chain.
No, it does not. The infinities does not say that that's the only position. Actually, it's actually a reply to the foundationalist demand, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So if the foundational is saying that, hey, our foundationalism is better, why? Because the anti-foundationalist is not able to do one job, this explanatory job that any successful metaphysics should be able to do. So the anti-foundationalist views are exhibiting that explanatory failure, that they are inferior in this sense. If
Correct.
we take explanatory